All right. So, as I said, good morning. We are starting to uh, learn about the Book of Esther and the holiday of Purim. That is the plan for the next couple of weeks. All right. So, before we get into the Book of Esther, I need to explain the structure of where in the Torah the Book of Esther belongs. So, forgive me if I'm repeating some of the obvious. It's always better to clarify and maybe repeat something which is obvious than have it the other way around, where um, we leave out some important details and then there's elements of confusion. All right. So when we talk about the Torah, what do we mean when we say the Torah? So the Torah could mean basically three different things. Either the Torah can refer to the 5 books of Moses. This is just in the language that people speak. Or the Torah can refer to general, Jewish knowledge, information. Or the other way is that the Torah can actually refer to what we call the Tanakh. What does that mean? That means that in general in Judaism, we have the written Torah and the oral Torah. The oral Torah, as we were discussing in our JLI classes, that's the Talmud and the Mishnah and the Gemara, all of that. But when we talk about the written Torah, not theoretically, the written Torah is divided up into 3 parts. That's what's called the Tanakh. Tanakh is an acronym for Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, which means Torah, sorry about that. All right. So the Torah, the word Tanakh is an acronym for Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. And it's 3 parts that make up what we consider to be the written Torah. The Torah is the 5 books of Moses. So in this breakup where there's Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, the Torah refers to the 5 books of Moses. The Nevi'im is the books of the prophets. There are many, many books of the prophets. And those books of the prophets, I'll show it to you on the screen over here. The people in person have it on paper. We have, right, the Torah is made up of the 5 books of Moses. That's the written Torah scroll that you'll find in every synagogue. The books of Genesis, what we call Bereshis, Shmos, Exodus, Leviticus, Vayikra, Bamidbar, Numbers, Devarim, Deuteronomy, right? So that's typically the Torah. Again, the Torah that we read every Saturday, the Torah that you use at your bar mitzvah, the Torah scroll sitting in the synagogue, that's made up of these 5 books. Now, these 5 books of the Torah, the storyline in those 5 books ends with the death of Moses and the Jewish people going into the land of Israel under the leadership of Joshua. So then there is a second set of books called Nevi'im, the prophets, which pick up the storyline. And the first one is called the Book of Joshua. And at great length, we discuss the conquest of the land of Canaan, famous story of the walls of Jericho, the division of the land, all of those kinds of things. Now, in today's day and age, we do not have these books on scrolls. We do not have them on, parchment with ink, and we don't keep them at the front of the synagogue. But in every house or in every synagogue, in every library, you'll find the books of the prophets. Sometimes it's in 1 volume, sometimes it's divided into different volumes. And that's what we have. So begins with the book of Joshua. Then you have, which now Joshua takes the Jewish people into the land of Israel. So historically, 5 books of Moses is from creation till the end of the 40 years in the desert, not yet going into the land of Israel. That includes Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Egypt, and so on and so forth. And Joshua is the one that takes the Jewish people into the land of Egypt. And the next many books that are made up of the prophets are all the Jewish people in the land of Israel. So you have the famous Book of Judges. The leaders of the Jewish people at that point were the judges. They made up many people, and so on and so forth. Then comes the famous Book of Samuel, Samuel 1 and Samuel 2, Shmuel Aleph and Shmuel Beis. Shmuel being one of the formative, famous prophets who anoints King David who anoints King Saul as king, and then anoints King David as king, and so on. You have the Book of Kings, and at this point, you have also what's happening is that in Israel, they build a temple. So the Jewish people went into the land of Israel, but for somewhere in the region of 400 years, they didn't have an official temple. They just had the Mishkan, the tabernacle that Moses built. They had it sitting in Israel, not in Jerusalem. So it's under the reign of King David that Jerusalem becomes the capital, and then King Solomon, his son, builds the temple, and so on and so forth. A lot of trouble, politics, as you can imagine. We have all of these prophets, famous Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then a book called the 12 Prophets, which are, Hosea, Amos, Obadiah, the famous book of Jonah, Habakkuk, and so on and so forth. Then there is a third section to the Tanakh, to what we would consider to be the written Torah of the Jewish people. The third section is called Ketuvim. And Ketuvim doesn't necessarily follow anymore a historical order. So for the most part, the books of the prophets are following a historical order. It's the order of the prophets, for the most part, as they were in history. Again, for the most part, there could be an exception to that. But the book of Ketuvim, the section called Ketuvim, which has a number of books in it, is not necessarily in historical order. So we start with the very famous book of Psalms, which is written by King David, Proverbs. We have the book of Job, which is much debated as to exactly when in history the book of Job happened. The book of Shir HaShirim, which is written by King Solomon. The famous book of Ruth. So now you have 5 books which all go by the word Megillat, which means the scroll of. So you have what's called Megillat Ruth, the scroll of Ruth, and her famous story. You have Lamentations called Eicha, and that's after the temple was destroyed, or at the time of the destruction. The prophets wrote this book of Lamentations, kind of lamenting the destruction. You have the famous Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, which is King Solomon's wisdom. Then you have the book that we want to talk about, which is the Book of Esther. You have the book of Daniel, and you have Ezra and Nehemiah, which is the story of the return of the exiles from Babylon. And lastly, you have Divrei Hayamim, which is Chronicles. So these 3 sections called Torah, 5 books of Moses, the Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Ketuvim all make up what we call the written Torah, the written law. So you've obviously heard of the written Torah versus the oral law. If you want to know the law, how to keep Shabbos, how to write tefillin, you don't go to any of these books. Then you need the oral Torah, which is the Talmud, the Mishnah, the Gemara, Code of Jewish Law, so on and so forth. But these 3 sections make up the written Torah. So when do we read these books? So the actual 5 books of Moses we read on an annual basis. Every Saturday we read another section, and we finish the whole Torah once a year. The prophets, there's not really a formal reading of the prophets from beginning to end. Publicly, we do read from the prophets every Saturday and every holiday, what's called the Haftorah. So anytime we read, not anytime, but any Saturday or any holiday that we read from the Torah, when we finish reading from the Torah, we will pick a piece of prophet, not in order, but just a piece of the prophets, and it could be jumping around, to read on Saturdays as well. And then the last section, which is called Ketuvim, the writings. So when do we read those things? So that's also not on such an organized schedule, but Psalms, many of the prayers come from the book of Psalms. The book of Ruth, many people have accustomed to read it on Shavuot. Lamentations we read on Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. So it's kind of scattered throughout. And of course, the Megillat Esther, the Book of Esther, we read every year twice on Purim. Now, I mentioned before that nowadays we don't have scrolls of these books. The only book that we have in a scroll is the 5 books of Moses, plus one more, which is the Book of Esther. The Book of Esther, when we read it on Purim, has to be read from a handwritten scroll, parchment on ink, just like a Torah scroll. So Esther, the Book of Esther, is very unique in that sense that it's the only one. If you go to synagogues on Saturdays, we finish reading from the Torah, which is from a scroll. And then when we read the one section from the prophets, here and there and there and here, it's not from a handwritten scroll, it's just from a printed book. Or when one reads the book of Psalms, it's from a printed book. When one reads Lamentations, the only other handwritten scroll that we use to read a certain book, again, is the 5 books of Moses. And on Purim, when we read the Book of Esther, which we read the Book of Esther twice, once at night and once during the day, it has to be written from a kosher scroll on parchment, handwritten by a professional scribe. Good morning, good morning. All right, so now we understand a little bit of the structure of where the Book of Esther comes in and when it's read. Let's talk a little bit about the history behind the Book of Esther, when it happens and where it happens and so on and so forth. So Moses, I'm going back to Moses. Moses takes the Jewish people out of Egypt, leads them into the desert. They are in the desert for 40 years. The end of the 40 years of the desert, Moses dies, and a man called Joshua takes the Jewish people into the land of Israel. The Jewish people are in the land of Israel now. They're going to be in the land of Israel for about 850 years. From when Joshua takes them into the land of Israel till they get expelled and exiled, which is when the Purim story is going to happen, it's about 850 years. During those 850 years, at first, there is no temple in Jerusalem. There is no king. There is just judges, prophets. So you might have heard of the famous man called Eli, who it's written about a lot about him in the books of the prophets. And they have the same tabernacle, that same mini temple that Moses built in the desert. They brought it with them and they set it up in a certain place and they give it an element of permanence. So it's not like it's moving around back and forth, but it's not yet an actual full-on building built in Jerusalem. What happened is after, a few hundred years, the Jewish people come and they say to the prophet, because the prophet was basically the leader of the Jewish people, that they want a king, which Hashem got very upset about, actually, when the Jewish people asked for a king. And God told the prophet Samuel that he should appoint a king. And the first king of the Jewish people was a man called King Saul. Now, the reason why the king kind of changes everything is because now they're more than just a nation that lives in a country. They're with a king, and the king really kind of solidifies the fact that the Jewish people live in Israel. He puts together a strong army, and he's solidifying the borders. King Saul, we're not getting into his story, but God decides that it's not going to be his descendants that are going to be the forever reign of the Jewish people. So a new king is chosen who go by the name King David, and God promises King David that you're the chosen one. You're from your descendants are going to come the forever kings of the Jewish people. King David is the one that sets up the capital of the Jewish people in Jerusalem. That's why still today you go to Jerusalem, you have Ir David, city of David, right? Ancient Jerusalem. And King David is a mighty, mighty warrior who basically solidifies the borders of Israel safe. Everybody's afraid of King David. And his son, King Solomon, takes it to the next level upon the peace that his father, King David, built, and he builds the temple in Jerusalem. And this is the golden era of the Jewish people. King Solomon is the golden era of the Jewish people. They're in Israel. Jerusalem's the capital city. They have a king. The king is righteous. They're safe, spiritually strong, physically strong. Everything is amazing. From when King Solomon built the temple, that temple lasted 410 years. Obviously, King Solomon himself didn't live 410 years, but that temple that he built for 400 lasted 410 years. Now, for those 410 years, not everything was so peaceful. The Jewish people had a split. There was some civil war, and they had the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and that's where the 10 lost tribes comes from. So all sorts of exciting things happening during those 410 years. Towards the end of the 410 years, Israel is attacked by the Babylonian Empire, led by a very evil man called Nebuchadnezzar. And basically, not in one day, but over a period of time, Jews are sent into exile into Babylon, and all sorts of different things happen. And eventually, the temple is destroyed. So the temple is burnt to the ground. Not every Jew leaves the land of Israel, but for the most part, we have now entered exile, which to the Jewish people was extremely traumatic because we've been living in Israel for 850 years. Before those 850 years, there was Moses, who took the Jewish people out of Egypt. So, like, what do Jewish people know about being in exile? They don't really know about being in exile. Now, what's important to understand is that there was a prophecy. This plays a big role in the understanding of the Purim story. There was a prophecy that the prophets prophesied that the Jewish people will be in exile for 70 years. That this exile, which was first temple destroyed, was going to be 70 years. Now, exactly how to count those 70 years became a massive point of contention because the exile didn't necessarily happen only in one day. There was different events along the way that caused the exile. The leadership was taken down and destroyed and sent into exile. The prophets were sent into exile. The temple was destroyed. There was different markers along the way of how to count these 70 years. But it's important for you to remember that when studying the Book of Esther, there's this prophecy that the Jewish people would return to Israel after 70 years. Eventually, by the way, that does happen. Famous people called Ezra and Nehemiah take a large group of Jewish people back to the land of Israel and they rebuild the temple. So shortly following the Purim story, there is a return to Egypt, to Israel, and we rebuild the temple and so on and so forth. But that's the historical kind of piece that you have to understand. First temple, destruction of the first temple, the promise of 70 years, and this Babylonian exile, which is now taking place. So the king, yes? Any clarifications about that very basic, very short historical overview?
One quick question about the Babylonian deal, because one of the most famous Torahs was the Babylonian.
So here's the Jewish people, they've been exiled, and now the kingdom that exiled them, which was started with Nebuchadnezzar, also goes through a lot of turmoil. So while the Jews are being exiled, there's also a lot of turnover in the Babylonian regime. And the Purim story picks up under the reign of a king called Ahasuerus. I honestly don't know what his historical name is, but this king Ahasuerus, he moved the capital to a city called Shushan, which was in Persia. So it's referred to as the Persian Empire. There's this overlap between the Babylonian Nebuchadnezzar and the Persian Empire. And he also married, he himself wasn't from royal blood, but he himself married the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar. So his wife was from royal blood, and that also plays a role in the story. But there was many kings kind of along the way. There was a man called Belshazzar and Koresh and other people. And by the way, one of these few kings along the way actually gave the Jewish people permission to go back and rebuild the temple, but it didn't work out. So here we are. We are in a city called Shushan, which is now the capital city. And the Book of Esther tells us that Ahasuerus, the king, had become so powerful that he had taken over rulership of the entire civilized world. I don't know because I never studied and I'm not learned enough to tell you how this fits with the history books, the way they are written in secular sources. I don't know. But over here in the book of Esther, which we call the Megillah, it does tell us that he had his capital in a place called Shushan. So it's now the Persian Empire, that's in Persia. And he ruled over 127, states, countries, which is understood to be all of the civilized world at that time. So he was a very, very powerful king with everybody at his, beck and calling. And the reason why this is important is because eventually down the road, when we're going to learn about the fact that he gave permission to kill all the Jews, there was nowhere for the Jews to run. It's not like you can escape Europe and go to America. Any country, all of the civilized countries of the world at that time were under his rule. So when he gave permission to Haman to kill all of the Jewish people, as we'll learn soon, every single Jew was threatened at that time. So the book of Esther begins that King Ahasuerus, it says it was in the days of Ahasuerus, and he ruled, gives you the cities. It gives you the city from a city called Hodu till Cush, which was 127 provinces. I will print out for you. All right, so I print.
Feast of 6 months?
Apparently.
It's a lot of feasts.
It's a lot of food, a lot of drink, huh?
A lot of food and drink.
So I printed, and as you can see on the screen as well, for those that are on Zoom, here we have the overview of the story of Purim. So the years on the right-hand column, 3392, that's according to Jewish count. And then 369 BC is, 369 BC, that means it's 2004, basically 2,400 years ago is when the story takes place. Right? This year in the Hebrew calendar is 5,785, so that was the year 3392. So this will be just a quick overview of the story, but so you understand historically a little bit when it happens. Ahasuerus, who's the king, ascends the throne of Persia. That's in the year 3392. He has a feast that lasts 180 days. 3 years after he ascends to the throne. Now, this is very important, and it's based on what I said before. So all of the Persian Babylonian kings were trying to figure out this prophecy that the Jewish people had of 70 years. When was it over? How do you count the 70 years? So Ahasuerus, the previous king before Ahasuerus, did a count. But at some point, he decided that 70 years were up and the Jewish people were not being redeemed. So the prophecy was obviously wrong. And things didn't work out so well for him. Belshazzar was overthrown, or he died, and Ahasuerus now took over. So Ahasuerus makes a calculation based on these 70 years. And he says that the 70 years of the Jewish people returning to Israel ends in the 3rd year of his reign. So in the 3rd year of his reign, he sees that the Jewish people aren't going anywhere. He's not being overthrown. He didn't die. Nothing's happening. Everything is, in Yiddish, we say, shah still. Everything's quiet, beautiful, no problem. So he makes a celebration, and the commentaries tell us that celebration is to celebrate the fact that the Jewish people were not returning to Jerusalem. If you go back a little bit further, it's not over here on these notes, but the temple is destroyed, or Nebuchadnezzar. I'll give you the years so you understand the 70 count. Are you ready? It goes as follows. And we'll do on Hebrew years or English years. What's easier to work with?
What's the difference?
The difference is when you count BC, I always get mixed up in my math because I have to count backwards. It's a complicated math. If I tell you that the temple was destroyed in the year 440 BCE, how many years before 369 BCE is 440? Understand? If I give you the Hebrew year, it's a little bit easier. Let's do the Hebrew year. In the year 3320 is when Nebuchadnezzar lays siege to Jerusalem. So that's how many years before Ahasuerus ascends to the throne of Persia? He ascends 72 years earlier. Nebuchadnezzar, who's his wife's great-grandfather, conquers Jerusalem. Conquers Jerusalem as he did not yet destroy the temple. This is an important picture of it. He doesn't yet destroy the temple. He just took over Jerusalem. So now the army of Nebuchadnezzar roams the streets. They're in charge. Israel is now officially conquered. In the year 3327, which is 7 years later, he takes the Jewish king, whose name was Jechoniah, the king of Judah, and he sends him into exile. So for 7 years, the king was somewhat operating, or however that looked, under the Nebuchadnezzar rule. So in the year 3327, he sends the king of the Judah, of Yehuda, into exile. And then in the year 3338, which is another 11 years after that, he actually destroys the temple. So for 18 years, Nebuchadnezzar's army was in charge of Jerusalem, but without destroying the temple, which wasn't unheard of, because a neighboring army would come and they wouldn't necessarily destroy the infrastructure. They just took over. Now you're a territory of my kingdom. So 3320, Nebuchadnezzar conquers Jerusalem. Now it's his. 7 years later, sends the king, Jechoniah, into exile. And 11 years after that, in the year 3338, is when he actually destroys the temple. Okay? Now, as I mentioned to you before, different kings were counting these 70 years different. So along came a man called Belshazzar, and he said as follows. He said, when did Nebuchadnezzar conquer Jerusalem? In the year 3320. So what's 3320 plus 70? What's 3320 plus 70?
90.
3390. So in the year 3390, or in the year 3389, actually, at the end of the year, Belshazzar says the 70 years have passed, and obviously the Jewish people are never going to be redeemed because clearly the prophecy was wrong, and he throws a party. He also, I'm not sure if he dies or was killed, but that was also the end of his reign. Right? We know that that wasn't an accident, because when you throw a party to celebrate the fact that the Jewish people aren't redeemed, you also get in trouble. Now, what's on your paper in 3392, so there's probably another king in between there, who I don't know his name. And then in 3392, Ahasuerus ascends power. So there was a lot of confusion in this Babylonian Persian regime. And in the year 3395, which is now also in your paper again, Ahasuerus says, oh, the 70 years have passed. Because he's counting from when the king of Judah was exiled. So the king of Judah was exiled in the year 3327. So he doesn't count a full 70 years, but he says 68 full years plus 2 partial years. So according to his calculation, in the year 3395, that's when there are 70 years up. He said, my predecessor, Belshazzar, made a calculation, but he made the wrong calculation because he counted from when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem. I'm going to make the correct calculation, which is I'm going to count from when King Jechoniah, who was the Jewish king, was sent into exile. Right? If that's not the beginning of exile, when the king himself is sent into exile, when is the beginning of exile? Lands up, by the way, that he was mistaken as well, because Hashem did redeem the Jewish people 70 years after the exile, but it was 70 years after the destruction of the temple. So the temple was destroyed in the year 3338, and eventually in the year 3408 is when the construction of the second temple began. But now you understand what happened. So the book of Esther starts, and the first few words says, it happened in the days of Ahasuerus, who ruled 127 provinces, that in the 3rd year of his reign, he threw a party, a feast of 180 days. And now we understand, and the Talmud talks about this, and the commentaries explain, that this feast was a celebration of 70 years from when he thought the exile of the Jewish people started and the Jewish people are not redeemed. So you also have to understand what kind of a smack in the face that is for the Jewish people. Because soon we're going to learn that the Jewish people, he invited them to go, and there was a big debate amongst the Jewish people if they should go to his party or if they should not go to his party. Some felt, at the end of the day, we're under his rule. You got to make friends with the authorities. If If you don't make friends with the authorities, how are you going to survive in a foreign country? We're not in Jerusalem. We're not in Israel. We live under his rule. Let's go and placate him. Others said, how dare you go to a party which is to celebrate the fact that the Jews are in exile and are never going to be returned? And the commentaries take it even further, is that when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple, he confiscated, or I should say he stole, better words, many of the items that were in the temple, many of the vessels, literally plates, forks, knives, cups, many of those things he stole from the temple and he took to his kingdom. And the commentaries say that when Ahasuerus made this 180-day party, he brought out the vessels of the temple and he put it on display. So it was a huge smack in the face for the Jewish people that there he was showing off the vessels of the temple. That temple, which a Jew would never even be able to go into unless he was in a state of purity. Here's Ahasuerus, an evil, wicked king who's, parading them around, kind of celebrating the destruction of the temple, the destruction of Israel, and the fact that the Jewish people will never be returned. There'll never be a redemption for the Jewish people. Again, it ends up being that he was wrong, and if according to a different count, the 70 years, you just have to start counting much later, but then the 70 years was fulfilled, and the Jewish people did go back and rebuild the temple. And that's how everything in Judaism works. It just depends how you count, Try to tell that to the IRS. What do you mean? You just started counting from the wrong place, Why do you start counting from 0? You should have started counting from 100,000.
Yeah.
Another version of yeshiva math.
Right? Well, here wasn't yeshiva math. Here was the Achashverosh math. So the Megillah tells us Achashverosh is sitting. He comes to king, and he comes to power, and it's in the 3rd year of his reign, and he throws 180-day party. It's a serious party, right? Not many people can afford to throw a 180-day party. Now, what's also interesting is that at this point, you don't see necessarily any particular distaste or hate, at least on the apparent level, towards the Jewish people.
Was the 180 days, is that symbolic? Is there something about 180 days? How'd they pick 180 days? They could have done 60, 90.
It's a good question. It's definitely on purpose.
Oh, it was on purpose. They purposely wanted 180 days.
Yeah, I have to read why, because I can't remember, but there was something about it. We'll come across it probably. It's a good question. We'll come across it. Now, but just to keep in mind, it's a good question. I don't know right now the answer, but I think we'll come across it as we go through.
Important. I'm just curious.
So what it's just to point out that at this point, the Jewish people are not necessarily hated, or at least it doesn't say that. They are celebrating the fact that they're not going back into Israel, but for the most part, other than that, so then become citizens of Persia. And within a very short amount of time, Haman turns everybody against them, which is at the time may have seemed surprising, but kind of talks to the way a Jew lives in the world, which is that, are we ever going to be truly accepted by the nations of the world? Or are we always going to be strangers in exile? Because that's kind of at the backdrop of this whole story, there's a very big argument, I mentioned this before, between Mordechai, who's the leader of the Jewish people, and many of the other Jews. Many Jews, including to this feast. So the commentaries tell us that Ahasuerus invited the Jewish people to this feast. He said, come celebrate with us, come party with us. And according to many commentaries, he even offered them kosher food and kosher wine at this party. So some of the Jews said, how do you not go to such a party? 180 days. You don't have to go for all 180 days, but I think 180 days was kind of like there was time for everybody from every country or to appear. So not, I don't have to go for all 180 days, but let's go show respect to the king. Or the king, is making a party, or we shouldn't go. So Mordecai, who was the leader of the Jewish people at that time, he had been, a direct remnant of the high court in Jerusalem. He was the direct continuation of the leadership that was with the Jewish people, from before. He was well accepted as the leader of the Jewish people at that time. He told the Jewish people, absolutely no, we can't go. How can we go to a party that celebrates the destruction of the temple, the fact that we're not going into exile? And the Jewish people said, why? Well, some of them said, why? And there was approximately 18,500 Jewish people that ignored Mordecai's, instructions not to go, and they went. So you had this kind of debate. And the reason why I'm emphasizing this so much is because it reverberates throughout history. Where some are, listen, we're not in Israel, we don't have a temple. Let's assimilate amongst the nations of the world. Let's placate them. Let's make friends with them. And that way they're going to love us and we're going to be friends. Right? And then what happens? Never works that way, right? You can go to every party. You can follow every instruction. You can placate whoever you want. But it didn't take too long before Haman,
Is that like giving away land for peace?
It's like a lot of the different things. It's like trying to placate, Haman, even in the world that we live in, a lot of people say, I didn't realize there was so much anti-Semitism in the world, right? So Haman was able to fuel the flames of the anti-Semitism, and before you knew it, everybody was ready to kill all the Jewish people. Because I'm skipping over here, but what was Haman's plan? He was going to kill all the Jews. How are you going to kill all the Jews? Haman himself wasn't going to walk around the 127 countries and kill every Jew. It's not even that he put together an army that's going to kill. The instruction was to the regular citizens of all those 127 countries that each one of all of those citizens are instructed by Haman with the seal of the king to turn and kill their Jewish neighbors. They were relying on the regular citizens of the street just to kill their neighbors. That's what it was. And the army will, A, not do anything to you, or B, protect you. And the law instructs you to do this. But that was the plan. If Haman's plan would have gone through to kill the Jewish people, it would have been ordinary citizens that would have just murdered in cold blood their Jewish neighbor and then stolen their stuff and taken their houses. That was the plan.
But what was the why that Haman was able to create? I mean, let me say, in Germany, they blamed the Jews for everything that was going on with the economy and everything.
So in the Megillah, again, we're going back, 2,500 years, so it's hard to know exactly the sentiment on the street. But in the words of the Megillah, Haman told Ahasuerus that there's one nation, that they're scattered amongst all of the people, and they refuse to integrate and accept our laws. They're different, they speak different. So we don't have much of the anti-Semitic trope recorded for us, but Haman was obviously this, very, like a Hitler, who was very charismatic in some way. Haman's main job was to convince the king to give him permission. Once he had the king's permission, so then him and his,
But then did the king think, well, a lot of the Jews came to my party?
Apparently not, which is another interesting discussion. Ahasuerus, the king, is kind of this interesting character where he's kind of neither good nor he's really just a man that's for sale. That's all he is. Because in the beginning of the story, he's not against the Jews. Then Haman convinces him to be against the Jews. And then his wife, who lands up being a Jew, Esther, convinces him to save the Jews and kill Haman. So he goes down in the story as being a man without a backbone. Just whichever way the wind pushes, or whoever has most money, most influence, just kind of pushes him in either direction, because he doesn't have anything personal against the Jews. Haman convinces him to kill all the Jews. He agrees to that. And then lands up that he's married to a Jewish woman, so she pushes him in the other direction, as we're going to see the story. So he's like this two-faced guy, and that's much of the story where Ahasuerus, his primary reputation is basically just a man without a backbone because he's just all over the place. But we'll take the story one piece at a time. So here we are in the third year of Ahasuerus' reign, and he throws a giant party, and we're told that the party that he's throwing is to also show off his wealth. So I'll print this for you, and I'm going to show you that he is trying to impress the people. It seems like that was really the point of his party, to impress all the people that they should like him, appreciate him, and listen to him as king. The copy's in front of you. So here we have the story. And I'm not going to read word for word, but just basically the idea. So here's the king in the third year of his reign, which now you understand the relevance of the third year of his reign. And the king made a party of 180 days. To make things better, when he finished the 180-day party, which was for all the citizens of his kingdom, he threw a second party, which was only for the people of his capital, and that was a banquet of 7 days. And the Megillah talks about all of the great wealth that he showed off. You can read in verse 6, the silver, the marble. He gave everybody to drink in golden vessels, and there was plenty of wine. And in verse 8, it says the drinking was according to the law with no one coercing, which means, according to the commentary, that he offered both kosher and non-kosher. And everything was crazy. Crazy Persians drinking and having a party. What happened? Vashti, who was the king's wife, the queen, right? Jared, you were asking about Queen Esther. So this is how she gets involved in the story. The king is married to a woman called Vashti, who Vashti is from royal blood. The commentaries make sure to point out that Ahasuerus himself is not from a royal line. And this was very important in those days. And his wife was from a royal line. She was the great-granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar. She was Belshazzar's daughter. That was really his entrance to the kingdom, was through his wife. So she, at the same time, was having her party. And the Megillah tells us that it was on the 7th day of this party, and the king's heart was merry with wine. Basically, it's a fancy way of saying the guy was drunk. And he ordered, in verse 11, that Vashti, the queen, be brought before him with the royal crown to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was an incredibly beautiful woman. Commentaries point out that he ordered that she should appear naked. This wasn't, when it says with the crown, it means only with the crown.
Only with the crown.
With nothing else. So here's a man who's married to a woman that came from a line of royalty. And in his drunkard state, he orders that his wife, the queen, show off her beauty. Commentaries also say that they had an argument of which country had more beautiful women. And basically, this was his response. So when Queen Vashti heard that she had been ordered by her husband, the king, to come, she said no. According to the commentaries, not only did she say no, but she told him exactly where to get off. She told him, you're a stable boy, and you're not even, 1/10 of what my father would have been. You're definitely not even 1/10 of what my grandfather would have been. And she told him exactly where to get off. Also, according to the commentaries, is that Hashem made Queen Vashti some problems, that different, depends how far you want to stretch this, but different physical anomalies started to appear on her, whether she broke out in pimples or she started growing tails. I mean, it gets very fanciful, the stories. But basically, as a miracle, Hashem made it that even if she would have wanted to go, she would have been too embarrassed to go. And God was setting this all up, as we'll see soon why. So here we are at this party. Right now, it seems like the story has nothing to do with the Jewish people, right? That's also important to understand. As of now, it's just a bunch of Persians going bonkers, you know what I mean? They're having their party and there's some internal politics over here. That's pretty much all that's happening. So King orders Vashti to come Vashti says, no way. And now the king became extremely mad because he didn't know what to do, that he was message 1, 2, 3, and in front of everyone, his wife was telling him no. So verse 14, he meets with his advisors, and there's an advisor who his name is Memuchan, and later on we find out that this was actually Haman. And Haman starts pushing the king and saying, you can't let this go. She's not listening to you. She's making a fool out of you. And not only that, but he says, if you don't put your foot down with her, then word's going to get out that no woman has to respect her husband. And if the queen doesn't have to listen to the king, so in every single house in all of your entire kingdom, the woman can tell their husbands what to do. It's going to be the beginning of the feminist movement, right? And he starts pushing the king that he has to do something about it. Now, we're told, the commentaries tell us, that Haman was pushing Ahasuerus the king to have his wife killed because he wanted his own daughter to become the next queen. That was really his true intentions over here. So what did he do? He pushed the king, and eventually the king gave out a royal edict, a royal decree, that if she doesn't come, she's going to be killed, and that all women have to give honor to their husbands, both great and small, and that's what they did. So Vashti is now killed, and all of the women are told that they have to respect their husbands, and now the king in his drunken state doesn't have a wife anymore because she's sent out because she rebelled against the king. She is now killed. And that is where the first chapter of the Book of Esther ends. Again, at this point, it almost seems like it has nothing to do with the Jewish people. Vashti wasn't Jewish, Ahasuerus wasn't Jewish, Haman wasn't Jewish. And we're reading a book that's part of the Tanakh, part of the Jewish Torah. So all of this is just, kind of setting the stage. There's a lot of messages in here as well. But at face value, nothing really yet has to do too much with the Jewish people, although obviously everything has to do with the Jewish people. Questions or comments?
Not right now.
All right. So chapter 2, we'll just do a little bit. Chapter 2 starts off, and it says that after these events, so now the parties are over, and the Book of Esther says the king's wrath has subsided, and he remembered Vashti, and he was now upset. Doesn't say he was upset, but he remembered Vashti, and he remembered what he did to her. Which, by the way, the commentaries point out that she was a wicked woman. So it's not like we walk away feeling bad from her. She used to particularly take advantage of Jewish women. She had a thing out. She would get female women, Jewish slaves, and make them work in the most humiliating ways, disrespectful to them, disrespectful to the Jewish religion. She came from the Jewish line, but these Jewish line was all anti-Semites. Nebuchadnezzar, her great-grandfather, was the one that destroyed the temple and killed thousands of Jews while he did it. It's not exactly a Jew lover. So it's not exactly like we feel so bad for this terrible woman, Vashti. She was who she was, and, now she's gone.
So was Ahasuerus king only because of marrying her?
That was part of it, and because he was obviously very smart and very powerful, and whatever the political,
Intrigue at the time.
intrigue, the political, workings of the day. He managed to, I think the Babylonian Persian kingdom at some point wasn't so stable. A lot of kings were kind of going and going this is recorded that they were coming and going very short range, sometimes 2-3 years. So with the different abilities and tactics and whatever it is that he had, he made his way to the king. He wasn't himself from a royal line, but for sure helpful that he married. But it was obviously his intrigue and charisma and his abilities that got him to marry this woman. Otherwise, he would never have married. And there's also a bit of an argument of Ahasuerus, if he was a smart king, or if he was a dumb king. There's a lot of discussion exactly as to who he was. And because as I mentioned before, it just seems to be, he's drunk and one of his servants one of his advisors push him to kill his wife, so he kills his wife. And that's not exactly a man of, tremendous backbone, somebody that has a lot of conviction, and that plays itself into the story. He's wishy-washy all over the place, all the different times. And our understanding is that he's just a player in Hashem's hands, so to say. So here what happens is that the king says, okay, he needs to marry a new woman. So they basically start almost like a beauty pageant or a beauty contest where they are says over here, right? Let virgin maidens of beautiful appearance be sought for the king, and the king appoint officers in all the provinces, and let them gather every virgin maiden of beautiful appearances to Shushan the capital. So just however many young women are brought, and nobody's going to refuse the king. So now he's going to just choose for himself the queen that he wants from all of these different women. And this is going to set the stage for how Esther is eventually chosen as queen. And that, of course, plays a huge role in the story, but we're going to stop here for today.
So is Ahasuerus looking for multiple